19-1. For every F6F Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat during the Pacific War, 19 Japanese aircraft burned, broke apart, or spiraled into the sea. 5,223 confirmed aerial victories against 270 losses. No American fighter before or since has matched that ratio in a major theater war. The Hellcat didn't just beat the Zero, it ate the Zero alive. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, the man who invented the Thatch weave to survive against Zero's flying Wildcats, watched the Hellcat's first major engagement over Marcus Island in September 1943 and filed a report that used a word carrier aviators rarely put on paper. Easy. His word, not mine. Before this goes any further, drop in the comments what kill ratio people expected the Hellcat to have. Watch to the end and see how the real numbers stack against the guess. Hit like if something here surprises you, and subscribe so the next one shows up. The story starts 13 months before Marcus Island, in a Grumman Iron Works conference room on Long Island. June 1942. Midway had just ended. The Navy still flew F-4F Wildcats off its carriers, stubby, underpowered, brutal to fly, and outclimbed by the Mitsubishi A6M0 at every altitude below 15,000 feet. Wildcat pilots survived through tactics, armor plate, and self-sealing fuel tanks. They did not survive through performance. The kill ratio in Wildcats ran close to 1-to-1, acceptable only because the Navy could replace pilots faster than Japan could. Grumman already had a contract for the next fighter, designated XF6F. Leroy Grumman and his chief engineer, Dick Hutton, had drawn up a big airframe around the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 Double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder radial, the most powerful engine the Navy would clear for carrier use. The prototype existed on paper. It did not yet exist in metal. Then, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare, Medal of Honor, first Navy ace of the war, sat down with Grumman engineers and told them exactly what a Zero could do. Rate of climb and roll rate at low speed. The way it turned inside everything the Americans flew. O'Hare had killed 5 Japanese bombers in a single sortie off Lexington 4 months earlier. He knew what worked and what got men killed. Grumman listened. The wing got wider. A 40-degree outboard fold went in, so the thing would fit on carrier elevators. The cockpit stayed high for visibility, and the landing gear spread wide, 13 feet 4 inches, so nugget pilots fresh out of Pensacola could land on a pitching deck without cartwheeling into the catwalk. The first XF6F flew on June 26, 1942. From contract to first flight, 5 months. From first flight to operational deployment aboard USS Essex, 15 months. Grumman delivered 12,275 Hellcats before the war ended, at a unit cost of roughly $35,000, less than half the cost of a P-38 Lightning. O'Hare never saw the Hellcat reach full production. He disappeared over Tarawa on November 26, 1943, shot down during a night interception. The records don't say whether friendly fire or Japanese guns killed him. Chicago named an airport after him. January 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, a flight of P-40 Warhawks scrambled out of Darwin, Australia, into a sky that sounded wrong. The Zeros made a higher, thinner whine than anything American, almost a sewing machine buzz at distance, and then they came down through the overcast like dropped knives. 4 P-40s went into the Timor Sea. The 5th limped home with 37 holes in the fuselage, and a dead gunner slumped over the rear cockpit rail. The problem ran deeper than any single engagement. The A6M0 weighed 5,300 pounds fully loaded. A P-40 weighed 8,500. The Wildcat topped 9,000. Every American fighter in the Pacific carried armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, armored windscreens, weight the Zero's designers at Mitsubishi had simply refused to add. Jiro Horikoshi built his fighter around a single theological conviction. If the pilot cannot be hit, he does not need protection. The Zero climbed at 3,000 feet per minute, turned inside any Allied fighter at speeds below 250 knots, and carried 2 20mm cannon that punched through aluminum like a hole saw through drywall. American intelligence had known about the Zero since at least 1941. Claire Chennault's reports from China described its performance in detail. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics filed those reports and did approximately nothing with them. A captured intact Zero, the famous Akutan specimen recovered from the Aleutians in July 1942, confirmed what Chennault had already said. The test evaluation at NAS North Island noted the Zero's roll rate fell apart above 200 knots. Above 200 knots indicated airspeed. Lateral control becomes heavy and sluggish. That sentence handed American tacticians a key. Dive away. Never turn with it. Fight above 300 knots or die. The Wildcat pilots at Guadalcanal already knew this. They'd figured it out the hard way. Smoking wreckage on Henderson Field. Oil slicks in Iron Bottom Sound. Marine Major John Smith's VMF 223 ran a 19-to-12 kill ratio at Guadalcanal through pure tactical discipline, dragging Zeros into high-speed slashing attacks. Smith's squadron lost most of its original pilots doing it. The Hellcat needed to make the desperation unnecessary. 2,000 horsepower. The Zero problem had an answer. The Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp generated more power than any radial engine the Navy had ever strapped to a carrier fighter, nearly double the Wildcat's output. Grumman's engineers took that power and did something the Japanese design philosophy considered insane. They made the airplane heavier on purpose. 212 pounds of cockpit armor went behind the pilot's seat and headrest. The windscreen got a slab of bulletproof glass thick enough to stop a 7.7mm round at 50 yards. Self-sealing fuel tanks lined every fuel cell in the fuselage and wings. Rubber compounds that swelled on contact with gasoline, plugging holes before the fuel could reach ignition temperature. The whole package added close to 600 pounds over a comparable unprotected airframe. Horikoshi's Zero carried none of it. A single incendiary round through a Zero's wing root turned the airplane into a torch. Hellcat pilots took hits, swore, flew home, counted holes on the flight deck while the plane captain handed them coffee. Grumman's internal engineering notes from late 1942 described the armor scheme with a bluntness unusual for corporate documents. The pilot must survive the first pass. Everything else, climb rate, turn radius, ceiling, ranked second to that requirement. 6 M2. Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 3 per wing, 400 rounds per gun. The burst weight came to approximately 7 pounds of lead per second at a convergence point set to 300 yards. A 1-second burst into a Zero's engine, nacelles separated the cowling from the firewall. The sound inside the Hellcat cockpit, when all 6 guns fired simultaneously, registered as a sustained metallic roar. Not individual shots, just a continuous vibration that rattled fillings and blurred the gunsight picture for a half-second until the pilot's hands steadied. The R-2800 gave the Hellcat a top speed of 380 miles per hour at 23,000 feet, 40 miles per hour, faster than the Zero at the same altitude. Rate of climb, 3,410 feet per minute, which beat the Zero above 10,000 feet where the supercharger came alive. Alex Vrasiu flew Hellcats off USS Lexington. He would become the Navy's 4th-ranking ace with 19 kills. On a training hop before his first combat deployment, he rolled the Hellcat inverted at 12,000 feet and pulled through, felt the airframe groan but hold, and reportedly told his wingmen over the radio, "This thing's a truck, a fast truck." The Philippine Sea, 100 miles west of Guam. June 19, 1944. 8:30 a.m. Radar operators aboard USS Lexington picked up the first inbound raid at 150 miles. A smear of contacts so dense the scope looked like it had measles. 450 Japanese carrier aircraft launched in 4 waves across 8 hours. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sent nearly every plane he had. The pilots flying them averaged 200 hours of total flight time. Some had fewer than 40 hours in their assigned aircraft type. Japan's pre-war training pipeline, the brutal Etojima program that washed out 80% of candidates and produced the finest naval aviators on Earth through 1942, had consumed itself. The veterans died at Midway, at the Solomons, at Rabaul. Their replacements could take off and land and hold formation in clear weather. Gunnery training ran to a handful of live fire passes. Carrier qualification meant a few touch-and-go landings in calm seas. Against them, 300 Hellcats flown by pilots, averaging over 500 hours, many with previous combat deployments. Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard USS Essex, took his F6F up into a sky that smelled like avgas and salt and climbed to 25,000 feet. Below him, the Japanese first wave, 69 aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Judys, and Jills, came in at 15,000, strung out in loose formations that broke apart the moment the Hellcats dove through them. McCampbell personally splashed 7 aircraft in that single sortie. The gun camera footage shows his tracers walking across a Judy's canopy at less than 200 yards, glass and aluminum and pieces of cowling tumbling backward past his wing. It was like an old-time turkey shoot. The phrase came from one of the Hellcat pilots. The name stuck. By sunset, Japanese naval aviation had functionally ceased to exist as an offensive force. 315 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air. An additional 30 lost operationally, crashed on landing, ditched from fuel exhaustion, spun in from pilot disorientation. American losses, 23 aircraft to enemy action. The after-action report from Task Force 58 tallied the numbers with bureaucratic calm. Sources conflict on the exact Japanese loss figure. Some accounts run as high as 378, but the lowest credible count still produces a ratio above 13-1 for that single day. McCampbell finished the war with 34 kills, the Navy's all-time leading ace. He received the Medal of Honor. He lived until 1996, died at 86 in West Palm Beach, Florida. He rarely discussed the turkey shoot in interviews, an odd detail that probably means nothing. He kept parakeets in his retirement. 5,163 confirmed aerial kills, 270 aces, 19-1. No American fighter has matched that ratio. The F-86 managed roughly 8-1 against MiG-15s over the Yalu, the F-4 roughly 2.5-1 before Top Gun fixed its training problems, and the F-15's much-advertised 104-0 came against opponents who rarely qualified as peer competitors. Libyan, Iraqi, Syrian pilots flying export-model MiGs with downgraded avionics. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats between 1942 and November 1945. The production line at Bethpage, Long Island, hummed around the clock. The riveting guns sounded like hail on a tin roof. 3 shifts, 7 days. Unit cost ran to $50,000 in 1943, roughly $830,000 in today's money. Cheap enough to lose and built well enough to bring you home. The Navy pulled the Hellcat from frontline service within 18 months of VJ Day. Jets made it obsolete overnight. The F-9, F-Panther, and F-2H Banshee replaced it on carrier decks by 1948. Hundreds of Hellcats went to Naval Reserve units. Hundreds more got pushed over the fantail into the ocean, cheaper than shipping them home. The after-action assessment from the Bureau of Aeronautics, dated March 1946, summarized the aircraft's combat record in 4 pages of tables and a single editorial sentence. The F6F series met or exceeded all performance requirements established at the time of procurement. That's how the Navy says thank you. The Japanese pilots who faced Hellcats over the Philippine Sea and Formosa, over Iwo Jima, most of their names exist only in unit rosters, archived at the Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies. They flew into those formations knowing the math had turned against them. A few carried 500 hours, others had barely 50. Vrasiu, asked decades later what he remembered most about the Hellcat, said, "The sound of that Pratt and Whitney catching on the first try, 5 in the morning, still dark, the whole ship shaking under you while you waited for the launch officer's flag."